shadows clung to Rebecca long before the Alpha King ever noticed her existence. Born a wolf who could not shift, she was less than a ghost within the whispering halls of Ethelgard. Packmates stepped over her. Elders forgot her name. Yet when the sovereign ruler of all northern territories descended upon their courtyard to claim his tribute, his golden eyes bypassed the gilded nobles and locked solely on the kitchen maid scrubbing the stone floors. "She," he rumbled, "she is mine." Within the towering stone-wrought walls of Ethelgard, survival was entirely dependent on two things: the purity of one's lineage and the swiftness of one's shift. Rebecca possessed neither. She was what the pack elders cruelly referred to as a null, a werewolf, locked entirely within her human form, deaf to the call of the moon and blind to the primal instincts that governed her kin. In the rigidly hierarchical society of the Ashen Crag Pack, to be a null was to be a walking curse. It was widely believed by the superstitious denizens of the medieval fiefdom that a wolf who could not take the form of the beast was abandoned by the Maker, a vessel of bad omens and rotting luck. Because of this, Rebecca had spent the 20 years of her life learning the delicate, desperate art of utter invisibility. The morning the royal missive arrived, the castle was plunged into an unprecedented frenzy. Rebecca was in the subterranean kitchens, her hands buried elbow-deep in a wooden trough of freezing water and root vegetables, when the head cook, Beatrice, came bustling down the cobblestone steps. Beatrice was an older woman, plump and perpetually anxious, one of the few who treated Rebecca with a measure of pity rather than outright malice. "Scrub faster, girl," Beatrice gasped, clutching her chest as she leaned against the heavy oak table. "The fires must be doubled. Every hearth in the great hall needs to be blazing by midday. We are butchering the winter stags 3 months early." Rebecca paused, wiping a strand of damp dark hair from her forehead with the back of her shivering wrist. "Is Lord Cedric declaring a festival?" "Not a festival," Beatrice whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "A tribute. King Conrad is riding south. The Alpha of the Ironhold will be within our gates before the sun sets." The wooden scrub brush slipped from Rebecca's numb fingers, splashing into the icy water. King Conrad. The name alone was enough to send a cold spike of dread through the spine of the most hardened warrior. He was the sovereign ruler of the unified Pax, a warlord who had conquered the warring factions of the northern territories, not with diplomacy, but with sheer, catastrophic brute force. Rumors painted him as a monster man with the size of a mountain and a beast that stood taller than a destrier. He was said to be ruthless, cold, and entirely merciless. "Why is he coming here?" Rebecca asked softly, retrieving her brush and keeping her head down. "He seeks a queen," a sharp, venomous voice echoed from the archway. Rebecca tensed. Stepping into the dim light of the kitchens was Gwendolyn, the daughter of the Pack's lead enforcer and the undisputed beauty of Ethelgard. Clad in a gown of deep emerald velvet that clung to her curves, Gwendolyn looked entirely out of place among the soot and flour of the lower levels. She was flanked by 2 of her sycophantic friends, snickering behind their hands. "The king travels the realms to find a mate of suitable breeding and immense power," Gwendolyn sneered, walking forward and deliberately kicking over a basket of freshly washed apples. They scattered across the dirty stone floor. "Something you know absolutely nothing about, mudblood." Rebecca immediately dropped to her knees, her coarse burlap dress soaking up the dampness of the floor, and began to gather the bruised fruit. She did not speak. To speak was to invite a beating. She kept her eyes fixed on the hem of Gwendolyn's velvet gown, a stark contrast to her own ragged existence. "Leah be, Lady Gwendolyn," Beatrice interjected, though her voice trembled. "We have much to prepare. Lord Cedric requires absolute perfection for the feast tonight." "See that you achieve it," Gwendolyn snapped. She looked down at Rebecca, her lips curled in disgust. "And keep this wretched creature out of sight when the king arrives. If Conrad smells the rot of a null in our halls, he will think the ashen crag breeds weakness. I will not have my coronation as queen jeopardized by a kitchen rat." With a final disdainful scoff, Gwendolyn turned and swept out of the kitchens, her laughter echoing up the stairwell. Rebecca remained on the floor, clutching a bruised apple to her chest. She closed her eyes, fighting the familiar, humiliating sting of tears. She was used to the cruelty, but it never grew easier to bear. For the rest of the day, Rebecca was a blur of motion. She carried heavy loads of firewood up spiraling stone staircases, her muscles screaming in protest. She polished silver goblets until she could see her own exhausted, hollow-eyed reflection in the metal. She was ordered to remain in the shadows, to move only through the servant corridors, and to never, under any circumstances, show her face in the main courtyards or the great hall once the sun began to dip below the horizon. As twilight bled over the spires of Ethelgard, a deep, resonant horn shattered the evening air. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very bedrock of the castle. The king had arrived. From a narrow slit of a window in the upper gallery, hidden behind a heavy tapestry, Rebecca allowed herself a single moment of rebellion. She peered down into the main courtyard. The gates had been thrown wide open. Riding through the threshold was a vanguard of fearsome warriors mounted on massive armored steeds, but it was the man at the center of the formation that stole the breath from her lungs. King Conrad did not wear a crown of gold, but a jagged circlet of dark iron. He was a leviathan of a man, clad in plates of blackened steel, and a thick cloak of direwolf fur that draped over shoulders broad enough to carry the world. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and battle-won scars, his jaw clenched in a perpetual state of grim stoicism. Even from this distance, Rebecca could feel the sheer, oppressive weight of his aura. It was a suffocating pressure, a dominance so absolute that it forced the proud warriors of the Ashen Crag, including Alpha Cedric himself, to drop to their knees in the mud as the king dismounted. Rebecca stepped back from the window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She suddenly felt very small, very fragile, and entirely out of her depth. The world of kings and alphas was a violent, dangerous place, and she was merely a ghost trying to survive the crossfire. The great hall of Ethelgard was a masterpiece of medieval grandeur, transformed for the evening into a glittering spectacle of wealth and power. Long oaken tables groaned under the weight of roasted boars, spiced fowls, and towering wheels of sharp cheese. Tapestries depicting great hunts hung from the rafters, and massive iron chandeliers bathed the room in a warm, flickering golden glow. At the high table, seated upon an elevated dais, was King Conrad. He looked profoundly bored, despite the musicians plucking frantic, lively tunes on their lutes, and despite the finest wine flowing freely into silver goblets. The Alpha King sat in absolute silence. His golden eyes, striking predatory and unnervingly, still scanned the room with the detached disinterest of a wolf watching a flock of mundane sheep. Beside him, Alpha Cedric was sweating profusely, leaning in every few moments to point out one of the high-born females of the pack. Gwendolyn, seated at a prominent table just below the dais, was practically glowing. She had changed into a gown of crimson silk, her neck adorned with heavy gold jewelry. She laughed loudly, tossing her hair, desperately projecting the image of a vibrant, fertile, and powerful mate. Conrad did not spare her a second glance. He took a slow, deliberate drink from his goblet, his mind wandering to the borders of his territory, to the trade disputes in the east, to anything other than this tedious parade of vanity. He had come south not out of a desperate desire for a bride, but out of political necessity. The Council of Elders had demanded an heir, and tradition dictated he evaluate the females of the allied packs. Yet every female he encountered smelled the same of cloying perfume, desperate ambition, and manufactured subservience. His wolf, the massive beast resting beneath his skin, remained entirely dormant. Down in the scullery, a disaster was unfolding. "We are out of the spiced wine," Beatrice hissed, wringing her hands as a young server ran back into the kitchens, breathless and pale. Lord Cedric specifically demanded the High King's goblet never reach the bottom. "There is a cask in the cellar, but it is too heavy for me to lift alone," the young boy panicked. Beatrice whirled around, her eyes landing on Rebecca, who was currently scrubbing down the butcher's block. "Rebecca, you must go with him. Bring the cask up immediately. Use the servants' entrance behind the tapestries. Pour the wine into the crystal decanters and hand it to the servers. Do not let yourself be seen." Rebecca wiped her hands on her apron, her stomach tying itself into a painful knot. Disobeying an order was not an option. She nodded silently, grabbing a set of heavy iron keys, and rushed down into the damp, lightless cellars. Together she and the boy managed to hoist the heavy oak cask up the narrow, winding servant stairs. By the time they reached the hidden corridor that ran behind the walls of the great hall, Rebecca was gasping for air, her muscles trembling from the strain. "Pour it quickly," the boy whispered urgently. Rebecca unstopped the cask and began to carefully pour the thick, dark red liquid into a towering crystal decanter. The noise of the feast on the other side of the stone wall was deafening laughter, the clinking of metal, the deep rumble of conversation. She just had to finish this one task and she could retreat to the safety of the shadows. But fate, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. Just as she filled the second decanter, a pair of drunken enforcers from the Ashen Crag pack stumbled into the hidden corridor, seeking a dark corner to share a stolen bottle of mead. One of them, a hulking brute named Gareth, tripped over his own boots and slammed bodily into the small wooden table where Rebecca was working. The impact was violent. The table shattered. The crystal decanters tipped and fell, exploding into 100 glittering shards on the stone floor. A torrent of spiced red wine splashed across Rebecca's dress, soaking her to the bone. "Watch where you stand, you stupid null," Gareth roared, attempting to cover his own clumsiness with aggression. He shoved Rebecca hard against the tapestry. The heavy fabric, old and worn, could not hold her weight. With a sickening, tearing sound, the tapestry ripped from its iron hooks. Rebecca tumbled backward, falling through the archway and crashing directly onto the polished floor of the great hall, right at the foot of the elevated dais. The music stopped. The laughter died. A horrifying, suffocating silence descended upon the room. Rebecca lay on the floor, paralyzed by absolute terror. She was covered in dirt, flour, and a massive stain of red wine that looked terrifyingly like blood. Her ragged hair was plastered to her face. Slowly, trembling uncontrollably, she lifted her head. Hundreds of eyes were staring at her in shock and disgust. Gwendolyn looked as though she might faint from the sheer outrage of the intrusion. Alpha Cedric's face turned a violent shade of purple, his lips pulling back to reveal his canines in a snarl of pure fury. But Rebecca did not look at them. She looked up. Directly above her, leaning forward in his massive wooden throne, was King Conrad. At the exact moment Rebecca had crashed through the tapestry, a draught of cold air from the corridor had swept through the hall. It carried with it a scent. It wasn't the heavy, artificial perfumes of the noble women. It was a scent so subtle, yet so impossibly potent, that it struck Conrad like a physical blow to the chest. It smelled of crushed rosemary, of wood ash, and underneath it all, a sweet, agonizingly pure scent of rain falling on dry earth. Conrad's wolf, dormant for decades, violently awoke. It clawed at his chest, howling a single, deafening demand into his mind. "Mate, Conrad's golden eyes widened perfectly. The air around him seemed to crackle, the temperature in the room plummeting as his aura, massive, dark, and possessive, flared to life, rolling off him in invisible, suffocating waves. The goblets on the high table vibrated. Several weaker wolves in the back of the hall collapsed to their knees, clutching their throats as the king's dominance crushed the oxygen from the room. Cedric, misinterpreting the king's terrifying reaction as anger toward the interruption, leapt to his feet. "My deepest apologies, Your Majesty," he barked, his voice laced with venom. "Guards, seize this wretched creature. Throw this null into the dungeons." Silence. The word was not shouted. It was spoken softly, a low, gravelly rumble that barely echoed, yet it sliced through the hall like a broadsword. Cedric snapped his mouth shut, the color draining from his face. King Conrad stood up. He bypassed the stairs of the dais entirely, stepping off the edge and landing softly onto the floor of the great hall. The crowd parted violently, scrambling backward, terrified of the lethal grace of the apex predator in their midst. Conrad walked slowly toward the ruined tapestry. Rebecca was frozen, her breath coming in shallow, terrified pants. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blow, waiting for the execution. Instead, a large, warm, heavily calloused hand gently brushed against her jaw. Rebecca gasped, her eyes snapping open. King Conrad was kneeling on one knee before her, heedless of the spilled wine soaking into his dark trousers. Up close, his eyes were mesmerizing pools of liquid amber, swirling with an intensity that burned right through her soul. He wasn't looking at her rags or the dirt on her face. He was looking at her as if she were the only living, breathing thing in a room full of statues. He leaned in, his nose ghosting over the crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply, a long, shuddering breath, his chest expanding. A low, vibrating growl of pure, unadulterated satisfaction rumbled in his throat. Conrad stood up, seamlessly pulling Rebecca to her feet with him. He tucked her small, trembling body behind his massive frame, shielding her from the stares of the room. He turned his terrifying, golden gaze upon Alpha Cedric, his voice ringing out with undeniable, world-shattering finality. "She," the Alpha King declared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "She is mine." Chaos erupted. It was not a physical riot, but a psychic shockwave of disbelief that battered against the stone walls of the great hall. Gasps echoed. Goblets slipped from numb fingers to clatter on the floor, and a frantic murmuring swept through the ranks of the Ashen Crag pack. Gwendolen shot to her feet, her chair scraping violently against the stone. "That is impossible," she shrieked, all pretense of royal decorum abandoned. "My king, you are mistaken. She is a no. A broken thing. She cannot even shift." And talk. Conrad did not even grant the screaming noblewoman the dignity of a glance. His attention remained entirely focused on the furious, trembling alpha of the territory. Cedric stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. The veins in his neck were bulging, caught between the instinct to submit to his king and the absolute humiliation of the moment. "Your Majesty," Cedric forced out, his voice shaking with restrained anger. "Lady Gwendolen speaks the truth. The girl is Rebecca. She is a defect, a stain on my pack. She carries the sickness of the unshifted. It is forbidden by ancient law for a royal line to be tainted by a null. You cannot claim her. Are you quoting the law to me, Cedric?" Conrad asked softly. His tone was deceptively calm, like the smooth surface of a dark river, masking a lethal undertow. "I am merely reminding the crown of the Treaty of Warwick," a new voice boomed. Stepping from the shadows of the noble tables was Lord Arthur, Gwendolen's father, and the chief military strategist of the Ashen Crag. He was a simple man, battle-scarred wolf who carried immense political weight. The pact that binds our territories states unequivocally, a king of the Ironhold must take a shifted, proven wolf as queen. If he chooses to mate with a null, he forfeits the crown's right to the northern pass. You would be surrendering the most vital military stronghold in the realm for a kitchen wench. A collective intake of breath sucked the remaining air from the room. The northern pass was the gateway between the kingdoms, a fortress that Conrad's own father had bled and died to secure. To surrender it was strategic madness. It was a bluff, a political trap designed by Lord Arthur to force the king to abandon this sudden, insane infatuation. Behind Conrad, Rebecca stood frozen in absolute terror. Her heart was a frantic drumbeat in her ears. She tugged weakly at the back of the king's heavy fur cloak. Please," she whispered, her voice barely a rasp. "My lord, they are right. I am nothing. Please, do not ruin yourself for me. Let me go back to the dark." Conrad turned his head slightly. He looked down at her over his broad shoulder. The terrifying, cold predator that had faced the hall vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a profound, grounding warmth. He reached back, his massive, scarred hand enveloping her small, trembling one. He intertwined their fingers, his grip firm and possessive. Sparks, hot and electric, shot up Rebecca's arm at the contact, a sensation so foreign and overwhelming it made her knees weak. "You are not nothing," Conrad murmured, meant only for her ears. "You are my soul's anchor, and I would burn this entire continent to ash before I let you go back to the dark." Conrad turned his attention back to Lord Arthur and Alpha Cedric. The warmth vanished. The monster returned. "Bring me the parchment," Conrad commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. Cedric blinked, stunned. "My king? Are you deaf, Alpha?" Conrad roared, the sheer volume of his voice making the stone floor tremble. "Bring me the treaty. Bring me the ink." Scrambling, two scribes rushed forward from the margins of the room, carrying a heavy ancient scroll bound in leather, along with a quill and an inkwell. They placed it upon a hastily cleared table near the dais, bowing so low their noses touched the floor. Conrad strode forward, pulling Rebecca gently along with him. He did not release her hand. With his free hand he grabbed the quill, dipped it into the black ink, and without a single moment of hesitation, slashed his heavy, commanding signature across the bottom of the parchment. He threw the quill onto the table. It rolled and dripped ink onto the polished wood. "The northern pass is yours, Cedric," Conrad said, his voice dripping with utter contempt. "Defend it well, for without my army's garrison there, the wild rogues of the east will test your borders before the winter is out." Lord Arthur stared at the signed parchment, his face draining of all color. He had called the king's bluff, only to realize the king wasn't playing a game. Conrad had just traded an empire's military advantage for a bruised, wine-soaked maid. "You are mad," Gwendolyn whispered, staring at Conrad as if he were a ghost. "You give up the realm for a wolf who cannot even hear the moon?" "I give up a pile of rocks for my queen," Conrad corrected, his golden eyes flashing dangerously. "And if anyone in this room, if anyone in this entire miserable territory ever speaks to her with disrespect again, I will return, and I will not sign a treaty. I will leave heads on spikes." The threat hung in the air, heavy and absolute. No one dared to breathe. Conrad turned back to Rebecca. Without a word of warning, he stooped down and swept her into his arms. Rebecca gasped, instinctively wrapping her arms around his thick neck as he lifted her with effortless ease. She felt impossibly small against the hard, armored expanse of his chest. "We ride," Conrad commanded his guards, who had already formed a protective phalanx around their king. "My king, the feast," Cedric protested weakly, though he dared not step forward. "Choke on it," Conrad replied without looking back. He carried Rebecca out of the great hall, leaving behind a shattered hierarchy and a stunned nobility. As they passed through the heavy oak doors and out into the biting cold of the night, Rebecca buried her face into the collar of his direwolf fur cloak. She was shivering not from the cold, but from the sheer, overwhelming reality of what had just occurred. She, the ghost of Ethelgard, the cursed Null, was being carried away by the most powerful, dangerous man in the known world. Conrad placed her gently inside a heavily armored carriage waiting in the courtyard, climbing in after her. He pulled a thick woolen blanket from the seat and wrapped it securely around her trembling shoulders. "You are safe now, little wolf," he said softly as the carriage lurched forward, the heavy iron wheels grinding against the cobblestones as they began the long journey toward the Ironhold. Rebecca looked up at him, her eyes wide, fearful, and filled with a million unasked questions. She had survived the cruelty of the Ashen Crag by remaining invisible. But as she stared into the golden eyes of the Alpha King who had just fractured a kingdom to claim her, she realized one terrifying truth. She would never be invisible again. Towering above the jagged cliffs of the northern coast, the fortress of Ironhold was a terrifying monument to military supremacy. Unlike the ornate, tapestry-draped halls of Ethelgard, King Conrad's seat of power was carved directly into the living, unforgiving rock of the mountainside. It was a place of iron, stone, and perpetual, biting winds. The journey north had taken 2 grueling weeks, during which Rebecca learned the startling duality of the monster she had been surrendered to. In the presence of his guards, Conrad was a statue of ice commanding, lethal, and entirely unapproachable. But within the private, velvet-lined confines of their carriage, he treated her with a reverence that bordered on religious devotion. He ensured she was wrapped in the thickest furs, personally handed her the choicest cuts of roasted meats, and spent hours simply tracing the delicate veins of her wrist with his scarred thumb, mesmerized by the steady rhythm of her pulse. Yet, as the massive iron portcullis of the fortress ground upward to admit them, the fragile, insulated world they had built in the carriage shattered. Waiting in the cavernous receiving hall was the High Council of Ironhold. These were not the soft, vain nobles of the south. These were battle-hardened warlords, their faces lined with scars and their eyes sharp with calculating intelligence. As Conrad led Rebecca by the hand into the torch-lit hall, the silence that greeted them was not one of awe, but of thick, suffocating judgment. Stepping forward from the ranks was Chancellor William, an elder wolf with a severely hawked nose and a mind renowned for its ruthless political cunning. Beside him stood Lady Victoria, the widow of a prominent general. Victoria was statuesque and terrifyingly beautiful, her silver hair pulled back into a severe braid, her icy blue eyes locking onto Rebecca with the precision of a hunting hawk. "My king," Chancellor William intoned, bowing rigidly. His eyes flicked to the small, raggedly dressed woman clutching Conrad's hand, and his lip curled involuntarily. "Word of your treaty reached us via Raven 3 days ago. The council has been in a state of deep distress. We prayed the missive was forged." "The missive was accurate, William," Conrad replied, his voice echoing off the vaulted stone ceiling. "The northern pass has been ceded to the Ashen Crag. In exchange, I have secured my queen." A murmur of genuine outrage rippled through the gathered lords and ladies. Lady Victoria stepped forward, her silk gown rustling ominously against the stone floor. "Your Majesty, forgive my candor," Victoria said, her voice dripping with a sickly, sweet poison. "But we look upon the woman you have brought us, and we do not see a queen. We see a human, or worse, a null. She has no scent of the wolf upon her. She carries no aura of dominance. How is she to lead the females of the pack? How is she to bear strong, shifting heirs for the Ironhold?" Rebecca shrank back, instinctively trying to hide behind Conrad's massive frame. The old familiar shame flared to life in her chest. They were right. Every word Victoria spoke was the absolute, undeniable truth. She was a broken thing, a liability that had cost the kingdom its greatest military asset. Conrad's golden eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. The temperature in the hall plummeted as his aura flared, heavy and oppressive. You look upon her, Victoria, but you do not see. You are blind to what the Maker has ordained. She is my mate. The bond is sealed in my blood and my soul. Questioning my choice is questioning my sanity, and I assure you, my mind is entirely clear. He took a step forward, towering over the Chancellor and the noblewoman. There will be a coronation at the end of the month. Rebecca will be crowned Luna of all northern territories. You will bow to her, you will bleed for her, and you will protect her. If I catch even a whisper of disrespect, I will not hesitate to thin the ranks of this council. Am I understood? Perfectly, my king, William forced out through gritted teeth, though his eyes burned with a rebellious fire. Conrad turned away, dismissing them with a flick of his cloak, and led Rebecca up the grand spiraling staircase toward the royal chambers. Once the heavy oak doors of the king's chambers slammed shut behind them, Rebecca pulled her hand from his grasp. She wrapped her arms around her own waist, trembling violently. "Conrad, you cannot do this," she whispered, tears finally spilling over her lashes. It was the first time she had dared to use his given name. "Did you see their eyes? They hate me. They will never accept a null as their Luna. I am a weakness to you. I will drag your reign into ruin." Conrad crossed the room in 2 massive strides, catching her gently by the shoulders. "Listen to me, Rebecca," he commanded, his voice softening. He tilted her chin up so she was forced to meet his intense gaze. "My reign is built on iron and bone. It cannot be ruined by the whispers of old men and jealous widows. You are not a weakness. You are the only thing in this world that brings peace to the beast inside me." But I cannot give them what they want," she sobbed, the weight of her lifelong inadequacy crashing down upon her. "I cannot shift. I cannot run with the pack. I cannot howl at the moon. I am trapped in this fragile, useless body." Conrad pulled her tightly against his chest, burying his face in her dark hair, breathing in the scent of rosemary and ash that drove him wild. "Then I will run for you," he murmured fiercely into her ear. "I will howl for you, and anyone who demands more from you will answer to my claws. You are safe here, my little wolf. I swear it upon my life." But Rebecca, resting her head against the heavy thumping of his heart, knew the dark truth of the world. A king could command armies, he could conquer territories, but he could not command the secret, venomous hearts of his own court. Ironhold was not a sanctuary, it was a viper's nest, and she was the softest, easiest prey they had ever seen. The weeks leading up to the coronation were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Ostensibly, the court obeyed their king's decree. Rebecca was moved into a suite of rooms dripping with opulence. She was bathed in scented oils, fitted by the realm's finest seamstresses in gowns of midnight blue and silver, and attended to by a flurry of handmaidens. Yet the hostility was an invisible, suffocating fog. Her handmaidens, daughters of minor lords, frequently forgot to light the fires in her chambers, leaving her shivering in the northern cold. When she walked the corridors, heavily guarded by Conrad's personal elite, conversations would abruptly cease, replaced by cold stares and poorly concealed smirks. The orchestrator of this silent campaign was undeniably Lady Victoria. She was always present, hovering at the edges of the court, her icy blue eyes tracking Rebecca's every nervous movement. Victoria had long believed she was destined to be queen, having spent years currying favor with Chancellor William and the military leaders. The arrival of a null had not just insulted her pride, it had stolen her crown. The climax of this silent war arrived 3 nights before the official coronation. Tradition demanded a grand banquet to honor the ancestors, a feast where the king and his intended queen would break bread with the highest-ranking military commanders. Rebecca sat at the high table to Conrad's right. She wore a gown of heavy dark velvet, her neck bare save for a delicate silver chain Conrad had clasped there himself. The great hall of Ironhold was a cavernous, intimidating space, the walls lined with the ancient, rusted weapons of conquered foes. Commander Henry, a massive, scarred veteran of the Eastern Wars, stood to offer a toast. To the strength of the Ironhold, Henry bellowed, raising his heavy iron goblet. And to the bloodline of our king, may it remain pure, unbroken, and fierce. Oh, it was a simple man. It finely veiled insult, a pointed barb directed entirely at Rebecca's null status. Conrad's hand clamped down on the table, the thick wood groaning under his sudden, furious grip. Before he could rise and tear the commander's throat out, Rebecca placed her small hand over his, squeezing gently. She gave him a microscopic shake of her head, silently begging him not to shed blood on her behalf. Conrad forced himself to remain seated, his chest heaving with suppressed rage. It was then that the royal cupbearer, a nervous young man named Thomas, approached the high table. He carried a silver tray bearing 2 ornate crystal goblets, filled to the brim with dark, spiced blackberry wine. He offered the first to King Conrad, and the second, with a slightly trembling hand, to Rebecca. "A special vintage, my lady," Thomas stammered, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the floor. "Sent with the compliments of Chancellor William to welcome you to the north." Down the length of the table, Chancellor William offered a stiff, polite nod. Beside him, Lady Victoria watched with an expression of rapt, breathless anticipation. Rebecca, eager to diffuse the lingering tension from Commander Henry's toast, smiled gently at the boy. "Thank you, Thomas. Tell the Chancellor I am grateful." She lifted the heavy crystal goblet. The wine smelled incredibly sweet, masking a faint, metallic undertone. She brought the rim to her lips and took a deep, steadying drink. The reaction was not immediate. For the first 10 minutes the feast continued. Rebecca picked at her roasted fowl, listening to Conrad discuss border patrols with one of his generals. But as the heavy grandfather clock in the corner of the hall chimed the hour, a strange, creeping sensation began to spread through Rebecca's veins. It started as a dull ache in her stomach, which rapidly evolved into a searing, white-hot agony. She dropped her silver fork. It clattered loudly against her plate. "Rebecca?" Conrad turned to her, his brow furrowing in immediate concern. Rebecca gasped, her hands flying to her throat. It felt as though she had swallowed liquid fire. Her vision blurred, the torchlight in the hall smearing into long, jagged streaks of orange and yellow. A cold sweat broke out across her forehead. "Rebecca!" Conrad's voice shifted from concern to sheer, unadulterated panic. He caught her just as her chair tipped backward, her body convulsing violently. Chaos erupted in the hall. Guards drew their swords. Lords and ladies leapt to their feet. Lady Victoria remained perfectly still, a cold, triumphant smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The poison used was wolfsbane laced with liquid silver, a concoction, specifically designed to bypass a werewolf's healing factor. For a null with a frail human constitution, it was an immediate, agonizing death sentence. "Healer, fetch the healer." Conrad roared, his voice shaking the heavy iron chandeliers above. He cradled Rebecca's thrashing body in his arms, his golden eyes wide with a terror the great Alpha King had never known. "Stay with me, Rebecca. Look at me." Rebecca could not look at him. She was trapped in an inferno. The fire was eating through her blood, burning away her organs, scorching her very soul. But then, as the agonizing pain reached its absolute zenith, something impossible happened. The poison designed to kill the wolf was actively searching for the beast within her blood to destroy. But Rebecca was a null. There was no beast to find. Instead, the lethal combination of silver and wolfsbane acted as a violently caustic key, burning away the heavy ancient lock that had kept her true nature suppressed for 20 years. Rebecca stopped convulsing, her back arched unnaturally, a sickening crack echoing through the suddenly silent hall as her spine realigned. "My king, step away from her," Commander Henry shouted, drawing his blade as he realized what was happening. "That is not death. She is turning." Conrad did not step away. He held her tighter, his eyes locked on her face as the impossible occurred before his very eyes. Rebecca's agonizing screams morphed into a sound that froze the blood of every hardened warrior in the room. It was not the howl of a standard wolf. It was a deep, resonant, earth-shattering roar that seemed to echo from the dawn of time itself. The dark, heavy velvet of her gown tore to ribbons as her body expanded. Coarse, thick fur erupted from her skin, not the standard gray or brown of the northern packs, but a startling, luminescent, blinding white. Her bones snapped and reformed with terrifying speed. Within seconds, the small, fragile kitchen maid from Ironhold was gone. Standing in the center of the great hall, towering over the overturned tables and the terrified nobility, was a monstrous, breathtaking beast. She was a lycan of the ancient blood breed, fought entirely extinct for 1,000 years. She was larger than Conrad's own formidable wolf form, her pristine white coat shimmering under the torchlight, her massive claws carving deep gouges into the solid stone floor. The white wolf shook her massive head, shaking off the last remnants of the deadly poison as if it were nothing but a mild inconvenience. She turned her massive, terrifying head toward the high table. Her eyes, once a soft human brown, now burned with the blinding, furious intensity of twin blue suns. She locked her gaze directly onto Lady Victoria, and the ancient beast bared her teeth in a snarl that promised absolute unholy ruin. Panic, absolute and unfiltered, shattered the frozen silence of the great hall. The beast that stood where the frail kitchen maid had been was something ripped straight from the forbidden tapestries of the old world. For centuries, the existence of the white lycans, the progenitors of all werewolf kind, blessed with power directly from the moon and immune to the toxic frailties of silver and bane, had been dismissed as nursery rhymes. Yet here she was, her snowy fur shimmering with an ethereal, violent light, her massive muscles rippling under her coat. She did not move like a newly shifted pup, clumsy and disoriented by the flood of heightened senses. She moved with the predatory, calculated grace of a sovereign taking back her throne. Lady Victoria stumbled backward, the triumphant sneer melting off her beautiful face, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. The hem of her expensive silk gown caught on an overturned chair, and she fell hard onto the stone floor. She scrambled backward like a crab, her manicured nails breaking against the cobblestones. "Kill it," Chancellor William shrieked, his voice cracking an octave as he pointed a trembling finger at the magnificent beast. "Guards, bring it down. It is a demon, a trick of dark magic." The Royal Guard, an elite phalanx of the most lethal warriors in the Northern Territories, drew their great swords. The ringing of steel filled the air, but not a single man stepped forward. Their inner wolves were whimpering, clawing at the insides of their minds, begging to submit. To raise a weapon against an ancient was to invite a curse upon their bloodlines for 10 generations. The white lycan let out a low, vibrating growl that rattled the weapons in the guard's hands. She took one massive, ground-shaking step toward Chancellor William. Suddenly, a shadow darker than a starless night eclipsed the torchlight. King Conrad did not bother to strip off his regal clothing. In a blur of motion and a symphony of snapping bones, his human form dissolved. A split second later, a monstrous black direwolf, the largest the modern age had ever produced, landed heavily beside the white lichen. His coat was the color of a moonless void, his golden eyes burning with lethal intent. Conrad did not look at Rebecca with fear. He looked at her with profound, reverent awe. Then he turned his massive head toward his own court, baring fangs that dripped with hot saliva. The message was unequivocally clear. She is mine, and I am hers. Threaten her, and you threaten the crown. The white lichen nudged her massive snowy head against the black wolf's thick neck, a brief tender gesture of reassurance. Then her glowing blue eyes snapped back to the cowering nobles. She bypassed the chancellor entirely and stalked toward the young cupbearer, Thomas, who was curled into a weeping ball near the dais. The lichen lowered her massive snout, her hot breath ruffling the boy's hair. She did not rip him apart. Instead, a projection of pure, dominating will slammed into the minds of every werewolf in the room. It wasn't a voice, but a psychic weight, an undeniable demand for the absolute truth. Thomas sobbed violently, his mind broken open by the ancient's power. "I am sorry, I am so sorry," he wailed, clutching his head. "They made me do it!" Chancellor William and Lady Victoria. They said if I did not slip the Silverbane into the Luna's cup, they would slaughter my family in the lower villages. Please have mercy. A collective gasp swept through the remaining loyalists. To poison a royal mate was high treason, punishable by a slow, agonizing death. "He lies," Chancellor William roared. Though his knees were visibly knocking together, he drew a hidden dagger from his velvet robes, a desperate, frantic glint in his eye. "The boy's bewitched by the beast. I am the Chancellor of the Ironhold. I act only to protect the purity of the pack." William backed toward the heavy oak doors, his eyes darting frantically. "You're weak, Conrad," he spat, dropping all pretense of loyalty. "You surrendered the northern pass for a cursed woman." "I did what had to be done, and I am not alone. Lord Alistair Covington of the Southern Reaches marches on our borders as we speak. We made a pact. We will cleanse this throne of your madness." The confession of treason, of allying with the notoriously brutal Lord Alistair Covington, was the final nail in the Chancellor's coffin. The mutiny was not just born of prejudice, it was a calculated coup. The black direwolf tensed, ready to launch forward and tear the traitor's throat out. But the white lichen was faster. With a burst of speed that defied her immense size, Rebecca's wolf cleared the length of the high table in a single bound. She landed squarely on Chancellor William, pinning his chest to the stone floor beneath one massive, heavily clawed paw. The silver dagger skittered uselessly into the dust. William screamed as the lichen's claws pierced his velvet robes, drawing beads of dark crimson blood. She leaned down, her jaws opening wide enough to snap a man in half, her jagged white teeth gleaming inches from his face. But she did not bite. She merely stared into his eyes, her ancient, blue gaze stripping away his pride, his ambition, and his treacherous courage, leaving nothing but a hollow, broken man. She lifted her head and let out a deafening, triumphant howl. It was a song of survival, a declaration of a dormant power finally set free. The sound washed over the castle, echoing out into the frozen mountains, signaling to the world that the true Queen of the North had arrived. One by one, the elite guards dropped their swords. They fell to their knees, exposing their necks in the ultimate gesture of submission. The generals followed, then the lords, and finally, even the weeping Lady Victoria pressed her forehead against the freezing stone. Only the black direwolf remained standing, his golden eyes fixed on his mate, his chest swelling with fierce, undeniable pride. The dungeons of Ironhold were cold, damp, and utterly unforgiving, a fitting residence for Chancellor William, Lady Victoria, and the conspirators who had aligned themselves with Lord Alistair Covington. Conrad's swift and brutal military response crushed Covington's advancing forces before they could even cross the river. The enemy soldiers, terrified into retreat by rumors that the Alpha King rode to war alongside an immortal god of snow and fang. But within the royal chambers, a profound quiet had settled. It was the morning of the coronation. Rebecca stood before a towering mirror of polished silver, her breath catching in her throat. The woman staring back at her was entirely unrecognizable from the filthy, trembling kitchen maid who had scrubbed the floors of Ethelgard. Her shift into the white lichen had permanently altered her human form. Her dark, mousy hair had turned a striking, luminous silver that tumbled down her back like liquid moonlight. The perpetual shadows under her eyes were gone, replaced by a radiant, terrifying vitality. Her eyes, once a dull brown, now held a permanent ring of icy, glowing blue round the pupil. She stood taller, her spine perfectly straight, her chin raised with an innate, unshakable authority. "You are staring at yourself as if you are a stranger," a deep, gravelly voice murmured. Conrad stepped out from the shadows of the bedchamber, already dressed in his ceremonial armor of blackened steel and deep red velvet. He stepped behind her, resting his large, heavily scarred hands on her waist. He met her gaze in the mirror, his golden eyes soft and filled with adoration. "I feel like a stranger," Rebecca whispered, leaning back into his solid chest. "For 20 years I believed I was broken. I believed the Maker had abandoned me. But all along, the wolf inside me wasn't dead. She was just waiting for the fire to burn away the cage." "You carry the blood of the first pack, Rebecca," Conrad said softly, pressing a kiss to the crown of her silver hair. "The records in the Grand Library confirm it. Your ancestors were the original rulers of this continent. The poison the traitors gave you, designed to kill a standard wolf, was the only thing potent enough to shock an ancient bloodline out of dormancy. In their attempt to destroy you, they gave you your crown." He turned her around to face him. He reached into a velvet box, resting on the vanity, and pulled out the diadem of the Luna. It was not a delicate, glittering thing of gold and diamonds. It was forged from dark iron and shards of jagged, unpolished sapphire, designed for a warrior queen. Conrad gently placed the heavy crown upon her head. It rested perfectly against her silver hair. "Are you ready, my queen?" he asked, offering her his arm. Rebecca took a deep breath. She thought of Beatrice back in Ethelgard and made a mental note to have the old cook brought north to live out her days in luxury in the royal kitchens. She thought of Gwendolyn and Alpha Cedric, who were currently drowning in the political ruin of their own making. But mostly she thought of the girl she used to be, the ghost who had hid in the shadows. "I am ready," she said, a voice steady and ringing with quiet power. When the heavy iron doors of the throne room swung open, the entirety of the northern nobility was gathered. The air was thick with the scent of pine, burning torches, and absolute unwavering submission. As King Conrad and Queen Rebecca walked hand in hand down the center aisle, no one dared to whisper, no one dared to look upon her with anything less than absolute reverence. The aura radiating from her was immense, a heavy, comforting blanket of power that demanded respect and promised fierce, unyielding protection. They ascended the steps to the twin thrones carved from black mountain stone. Conrad did not sit first. He turned to the crowd, his golden eyes sweeping over his people, and then he turned to Rebecca. The terrifying, ruthless warlord of the North went down on one knee before her, taking her hand and pressing his lips to her knuckles. A collective breath hitched in the room. following their king's lead. Every single soul in the great hall, from the highest-ranking general to the lowest servant, dropped to their knees. Rebecca looked out over the sea of bowed heads. She felt the ancient, powerful beast stirring contentedly within her chest. She was no longer a defect. She was no longer a null. She was the white Lycan, the ancient mother of the wild, the queen of iron and snow. And as Conrad rose to stand beside her, their hands firmly intertwined, Rebecca knew that the Northern Territories would never be the same. The ghost of Ethelgard had vanished forever, leaving behind a legend that would echo through the mountains until the end of time. If you were captivated by Rebecca's journey from a forgotten kitchen maid to the most powerful Lycan queen, do not let the story end here. Smash that like button to show your love for the White Lycan. Share this incredible tale of betrayal and triumph with your friends, and hit subscribe so you never miss another epic romance drama. We have countless more thrilling stories of alphas, ancient bloodlines, and destiny waiting for you. Drop a comment below telling us your favorite twist, and ring the notification bell to step into our world every single week.